What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video I'm going to be going through my week 3 tight end start sits. So going through every single week 3 matchup, talking about every single fantasy relevant tight end, listing them as either a start, fringe option, or a sit. The starts are the players that you should feel confident throwing into your lineup. The tight end position, the starts can get a little thin. The fringe options, these are players that you may not love them as your starting tight end, but they're suitable. These could also kind of be like your weekly streaming options. And then sits, these are players that you would prefer to keep on your bench or just not even on your roster. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Any questions, drop them down below. And let's just jump right into the first matchup. We have the Giants taking on the 49ers. And I think both of these tight ends are solid starts. Darren Waller, after a rough week 1, just kind of an overall rough week 1 from the Giants offense. He has a big bounce back in week 2, puts together a solid game, so he is definitely going to be a start. And then for the 49ers, George Kittle has been not great through 2 weeks, but this was always kind of the risk with drafting George Kittle. There's a lot of weapons on this offense, a lot of mouths to feed. Deebo Samuel had a big week 2. Brandon Ayuk was the guy with a big week 1. George Kittle's boom weeks are coming. They may not be super consistent, but he will have some big performances throughout the season. So if you spent like that round 4, 5, 6 draft capital on him, you can't bench him at this point because then you're just losing out on that potential peak. And he does have one of the higher weekly ceilings at the tight end position. His weekly floor isn't super high, but definitely someone that you should keep thrown into your lineup. Moving over to the Sunday slate, we have the Colts taking on the Ravens. For the Colts, even though Kylen Granson caught a touchdown on Sunday, not someone I want to be trusting for fantasy. On the other side, we saw Mark Andrews make his return. He was out in week 1, played in week 2, solid fantasy day. He's my tight end 2 moving forward, so definitely going to be a locked-in start. Then we have the Titans taking on the Browns. For the Titans, Chigo Okonkwo was someone who I thought was interesting heading into the season. Even though he didn't do much in week 1, his raw participation was solid. Here in week 2, that raw participation fell to 66%. Still didn't really do a ton. I really just don't think he's playable at this point. He could always improve his role or start getting more involved, but at this point, not someone I would trust in my lineup. On the other side with David Njoku, he had a great 88% raw participation on Monday Night Football. Unfortunately, he only saw 4 targets, kind of made the most of those, but also lost a fumble. So not an overall great day, but also wasn't a killer in your lineup. For me to trust David Njoku consistently as like a locked-in start, we're going to need to see Deshaun Watson play at a higher level. We haven't seen that yet through 2 weeks, so David Njoku is going to be a fringe option for me. In the next matchup, we have the Falcons taking on the Lions. For the Falcons, definitely got to talk about Kyle Pitts here. This was his second kind of dud game in a row. Not great performances through week 1 and week 2. I will say, on the more positive note, the Falcons had some solid passing volume, over 30 pass attempts, and Pitts was also, running routes on a strong percentage of plays. He had an 88% route participation. If the Falcons have that type of passing volume and Pitts is running, that percentage of routes, I have confidence that he will deliver you some solid fantasy performances, but he definitely can't be considered a locked-in start at this point. I still think he's worth being rostered. If someone's going to go out and drop him, I think he's just as interesting as these other fringe tight end options. But at this point, he's kind of more in the mix of tight end 2 territory. You're hoping he can string together some solid performances and the Falcons keep their passing volume up. On the other side with the Lions, I have Sam Laporta here upgraded to a start. I believe he was a fringe option last week. He's going to be a start for me here heading into week 3. Back-to-back 5 reception games. He's averaging 10.1 PPR points per game through 2 weeks, and that's with 0 touchdowns. If you can get a tight end averaging double-digit points with no touchdowns, that's pretty solid for fantasy. He had a very strong 84% raw participation, and I think he's a guy who should be viewed as a top 10 tight end moving forward. In the next matchup, we have the Saints taking on the Packers. If Taysom Hill has the tight end position flexibility on your platform, I do think he's a viable streaming option this week. Jamal Williams went down with injury in week 2. Seems like he's pretty unlikely to play in week 3. Alvin Kamara still has 1 game left on his suspension. And we saw on Monday Night Football, Taysom Hill took 9 carries. He also ran 12 routes and also threw a pass. So he's going to be involved, I think, with Kamara and Jamal Williams both potentially out. I think he's going to have a solid role on the ground. And the tight end position gets gross. So if you can get 10 carries out of Taysom Hill, he has a decent chance to turn that into 50, 60 yards, maybe get into the end zone, and that's probably going to be better production than a lot of the other tight ends you're going to find out there. So definitely someone to keep an eye on. Juwan Johnson, his raw participations have been solid. He really just hasn't come through with the production. I don't think this is going to be like an elite passing attack. And so then when you're having to compete with Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, Rashid Shaheed, you also have Taysom Hill filtering in. I just don't know if Juwan Johnson's really going to make a huge fantasy impact. On the other side with the Packers, I have Luke Musgrave listed as a fringe option. He hasn't put up big production through 2 weeks, only 8 and 4.5 PPR points in his 2 games, but his usage has been really solid. He had an 86% route participation in week 2, and he led his team in routes for the 2nd straight week, so he is their leader in terms of routes run here in 2023. So I think he's going to continue to get more involved, and not more involved in terms of his routes, but just commanding more volume, getting kind of settled into this offense. He is a rookie, so I think he's a fringe option, a tight end 2 play, someone who I definitely think is kind of worth rostering moving forward. Now this next matchup is going to be between the Texans and the Jaguars, and I actually have Dalton Schultz here listed as a sit. His raw participation fell off from 91% in week 1 to 71% here in week 2, and we have seen back-to-back really pass-heavy games out of the Texans, and Schultz has only managed to put up 6 receptions for 38 yards. If he can't produce with that type of volume through 2 weeks, there are going to be games where they're more in like the 30 to 35 pass attempt area, and I can't count on him at all to produce in those spots. We've seen Nico Collins ball out, Robert Woods has had some decent games, Tank Dell with a breakout. Dalton Schultz really just hasn't separated himself in this offense, so he's going to be a sit for me. On the other side with the Jaguars, Evan Ingram with another really solid game, hasn't gotten into the end zone yet, but has been able to be a solid play even without that touchdown upside. So a guy that I think you can trust as like a mid to back end tight end 1 play. Moving over to the Broncos Dolphins matchup, with Greg Dulcich out, we saw Adam Troutman really kind of firmly operating as their tight end 1. Just not someone who's super viable for fantasy. For the Dolphins, I think Durham Smythe is kind of interesting. His raw participations have been super solid. He just hasn't really put together great fantasy production yet. We'll see if he's able to do that. Definitely someone, just to kind of keep an eye on. But right now, don't want him in my starting lineup for fantasy football. Moving over to the Chargers-Vikings game, the Chargers are just going with an all-out tight end by committee, so you really can't trust Gerald Everett or Donald Parham. On the other side for the Vikings, you just continue to fire up TJ Hawkinson as a high-end tight end 1. Moving over to a divisional matchup between the Patriots and the Jets, Hunter Henry, with another really strong game. He's going to be a start for me. Week 1, he went 5 for 56 with a touchdown. Week 2, he went 6 for 52 and a touchdown. And he also saw his route participation rise from 72% in week 1 up to 91% here in week 2. So his role has been solid. Him and Mac are clearly on the same page. I think he's a nice start as like a back-end tight end 1 play. On the other side for the Jets, Garrett Wilson is the only pass catcher we should have any interest in for fantasy. So Tyler Conklin is going to be a sit. That leads us into the Bills taking on the Commanders, and Dalton Kincaid is going to be a fringe option for me. We saw Kincaid and Knox both have really strong roles in week 1 in terms of their route participation. Both of them saw their routes fall off in week 2, so this could be a spot where it's a matchup thing. A little bit disappointing because you would have hoped that, at least Kincaid, if you have him on your fantasy team, that he would have been locked into a more established role. It doesn't look like that's the case, but he's still someone that on a top offense, I do have him over Dawson Knox as like a fantasy option just because I think he's the better pass catcher in general. I think he's the better weapon. So he's going to be a fringe option. Dawson Knox is going to be a sit. For the Commanders, we saw Logan Thomas go down. I doubt he plays in this game. It seemed like he pretty much got knocked out pretty clean. So not interested in playing John Bates or Cole Turner. In the Panthers Seahawks matchup, not interested in either of these teams' tight ends. Hayden Hurst had a really strong week 1, but he came back down to earth in week 2. 3 targets, didn't do anything crazy. His raw participation stayed below 65%, and that type of usage on this offense, which isn't going to have a ton of passing volume, that's really just not a tight end position I want to be going after. For these fringe options, you want to see them either on a solid offense or getting really strong usage. Hayden Hurst doesn't have either of those. For the Seahawks, just full-on tight end committee. Noah Fant is going to be a sit. Then we have the Cowboys taking on the Cardinals. For Jake Ferguson, he has showed flashes of being involved both week 1 and week 2. He was targeted 7 times in week 1 and then caught a touchdown in week 2. His role is just not there yet. He doesn't have a consistent locked-in role yet. Sub 50% route participation in week 2. I just can't reasonably play a tight end who's running routes on under 50% of the dropbacks. Just can't happen. For the Cardinals, Zach Ertz is a fringe option. His route participation did fall to 78%, but that's still a pretty solid usage. Very involved, had the second most targets behind Hollywood Brown, and through 2 weeks, he has 18 targets and 12 receptions. The tight end position, that's very impressive. He does have a tough matchup here against the Cowboys, but I still think he's a fringe tight end 1 option just based on the volume he's going to be able to command. Next up is going to be the Bears taking on the Chiefs. For the Bears, I have Cole Kmet as a sit. His route participation completely tanked after week 1. I believe he was above 90% in week 1, fell all the way down to 61%. There's just no shot I'm playing Cole Kmet on that type of usage on a struggling passing offense. Just can't happen, so Cole Kmet's a sit for me. Obviously, Travis Kelce's a start. He actually didn't play like his typical role in week 2. Assume they're just kind of easing him back, but obviously he's locked in. Even on a limited role, Travis Kelce is still one of the top fantasy tight ends. Then we're going to have the Steelers taking on the Raiders, and Pat Freiermuth is at a pretty terrible start to the season. He scored a touchdown in week 1, which saved him, but in 2 weeks, he has 2 total receptions and 5 total targets. I mean, that's rough. Not really sure what the issue is. It's not like his role has drastically changed. He had an 84% route participation in week 2. I'm not completely panicking. I still think he's playable as like a fringe tight end 1. You would think Deontay Johnson going on IR would really open things up for him. So hopefully he's able to have a bounce back game here in week 3. He's been a very consistent option through his first 2 seasons in the NFL, so not sure what's going on early on. We'll see if he can bounce back here. And then for the Raiders, this is just a tight end committee. Austin Hooper, Michael Mayer, both are going to be sits for me. Then we're going to have the Eagles taking on the Buccaneers. For the Eagles, Dallas Goedert hasn't been great. Week 1, he was terrible. Week 2, he was fine. I think he was like 6 for 22. So in a PPR league, not terrible for a no touchdown game. This is kind of what I was talking about preseason about Dallas Goedert. He's not a high ceiling option. And if you're not aiming for a ceiling at the tight end position, you probably don't want to be taking these dudes in like the middle rounds, right? Like if you're not shooting for the Darren Waller upside, the TJ Hawkinson upside, probably best just to fade. I still think he's a start. Like his route participation is strong. It's not like his role has completely changed. He's going to be on one of the better offenses in the NFL. I think he's the same guy he was when you drafted him. He's just coming off of 2 not so great performances. And I think week 2 wouldn't look as bad if he wasn't coming off a really bad week 1, like 8-point-something points per game. That's not terrible, especially without a touchdown. On the other side for the Buccaneers, I'm going to be sitting Kate Otten. The wide receivers or the pass catchers I want to trust in this offense are going to be Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. And then the final game of the week, the Rams taking on the Bengals. For the Rams, I have Tyler Higbee as a fringe option. He's been underwhelming through 2 weeks, but his usage continues to be strong. He had an 87% route participation in week 2, 10 targets through 2 weeks. Not great, but also not terrible for the tight end position. We'll see if some of those targets that have just been funneled to Puka Nacua and Tutu Atwell, maybe a few of those shift over to Tyler Higbee here in week 3. I think he's a solid fringe tight end 2 option streaming play. And then for the Bengals, Irv Smith's route participation has been pretty decent. I just don't think you can trust him until Joe Burrow starts to look right, because the upside of Irv Smith is that he's a guy who has weekly touchdown upside. If Joe Burrow's not playing at a high level and there's not a ton of touchdowns going around, that value is pretty much not going to be there for him. So that's going to wrap it up for every single tight end matchup here in week 3. If you all enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. Any questions, drop them down below. I have my quarterback start sit posted, so check that out if you are interested. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.